Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those here in the room. Good morning to those joining us online. And welcome to the forum at St. Bartholomew's Church in the city of New York, where each week we host sacred conversations about the things that matter. Today's theme is Doctor, Will You Pray For Me? And we are so honored to welcome as our special guest Dr. Robert Klitzman, Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Masters of Bioethics Program at Columbia University Medical Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Klitzman. And of course, this is part of an ongoing series with our very own, the Reverend Molly O'Neill Frank, assisting priest and palliative care chaplain at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, who also serves on the ethics committee at both Memorial Sloan Kettering and New York Presbyterian. So it's wonderful to have you both with us. We have Natalie in the room. If you have questions throughout the morning, you can write them on the question cards and give them to Natalie. And if you're online, you can drop questions in the comments box on YouTube or email me at znyein@stbarts.org. A little more complicated this morning. But I'll go ahead and hand it over to the two of you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Zach. And thank you all for being here. As you know, this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's been just thrilling to be able to have such wonderful people in this series of three. We had Liz Blackler last week, who is the co-chair of ethics at MSK programming. We've got Bob this week and Michal Springer next week, who leads all pastoral care education and chaplain education at New York Presbyterian. I have to confess, Bob is also a very dear friend and somebody that I've gotten to know outside of the hospital and outside of this world of ethics, and it's just been a great pleasure and a wonderful journey with Bob. And I was one of the chaplains that he spoke to at length in his book. So I knew that he was writing this book, and I was very excited when it came out, and very excited to be able to get him to come here to share some of his insights. Bob is also somebody who has written many books, including Designing Babies, and many books that are sort of concerned with medical ethics. He's a prolific author, hundreds and hundreds of academic articles. He's a contributor to CNN and to various other, to the New York Times. And so, you know, he knows his stuff. And he attempted to take on chaplaincy and spiritual care in a sort of scientific way, which I think is really sometimes the two of them feel very opposing. And I think Bob has made this incredibly valiant and fabulous attempt to sort of figure out how we can work together. So I've asked him to come and sort of speak for a little bit, say 20 minutes or so, about the book, about his research, and then we'll open it up really with questions and conversation. Thanks,
Great. Well, thank you, Molly, and thank you, Zach, and thank you all for coming, and those of you online. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've always loved this church. I've been here a few times over the years, and it's an extraordinary building and a very inspiring one. So I'm very grateful to be here, and Molly is a dear friend, as she said, someone who I value immensely and who was extremely helpful as I started to work on this project. And I thought I'd start just by saying a little bit about why I embarked on this. And I should also say that this follows in some ways from the session that you had last week with Liz Blackler. And just as context, Liz works in clinical ethics, as Molly does in many ways as well. And clinical ethics looks at issues and questions that come up when patients or families disagree with what the doctors are suggesting. So often the patient may say, and her daughters in New York will say, well, we don't want heroic measures taken at the end of life. At the last minute, the long-lost son shows up from California. It's always a son, and he's always from California. And he hasn't hasn't seen mom for a few years, rarely speaks to her, and he comes to New York and says, don't you dare unplug my mother or I'll sue your off. And so they call the clinical ethicist, and what do we do, et cetera. So it's those kinds of tensions. Or I think you and Liz discussed last time a case of because there are shortages of certain medications now, a patient who said, how come I'm not getting the medication because the hospital is a shortage, and they have to decide who's going to benefit most. So those are extremely important questions that come up. I got interested in other kinds of questions, and I'm involved in those kinds of issues at Columbia. But there are other questions that come up about why me? Why do I have an illness? Did I do something wrong? Or my sisters say that if I'd prayed more, I wouldn't have gotten cancer. Or I wonder if I'd prayed more, would I have not gotten cancer? Or what's the meaning of my life? How do I find purpose, etc.? So chaplains deal with other kinds of questions, some of which are external, some of which are internal. Just to sort of put this in context of the other talk. So I got interested in this because, and there's a little bit of personal background, on 9/11, unfortunately, my sister was killed. She worked at the World Trade Center, and she called her best friend at 8:30 in the morning, and no one ever heard from her again. And the next few weeks, is for all of us in New York, was a terrible time. But I felt my family had to go through an additional level of problems. I had to go to the FBI and register as a missing person. We had no body. It wasn't until several months later we found a small piece of bone. That's all we had. We had to decide, would we have a funeral for her? What do we do? There's no body. So it was a terrible, terrible time. We had to clean out her apartment. And then, so I did all that, and then my body just gave out. And I just wanted to lay in bed, and I couldn't move. It just hurt to move. And I thought I had the flu. I didn't want to watch TV or go to work or listen to music. And my friend, and I'm a psychiatrist, and my friend said, well, this is just symptoms of grief. And I said, no, I have the flu. And they said, no, this is grief. And I said, but it just hurts. They said, that's grief. and I'm a psychiatrist. And in psychiatry and mental health, we often look down at patients who somaticize. So half of patients who see primary care doctors come in and say, my back hurts, my head hurts, or I hurt, and doctors think it's mental health problems, and why can't they just talk about it? And I realized, and we know, of course, that emotions are caused by biological phenomena in the body, right? There are hormones, there are endocrine chemicals that our bodies produce that make the mental states we have. So I was struck how little I knew as what it was like to be a patient, having been a doctor. And I'm Jewish, I went to my synagogue, and we went to a Buddhist church temple where we rang bells, and none of it really solved that for me or sort of got me over it. And then one day I was just sitting in Central Park, and the wind was blowing, and the grass was moving, and the trees were moving, and I thought, nature goes on. And to me that was very reassuring in a certain way. But from that I got interested in the question of how other doctors deal with being a patient and how it changes them. And so I got funding from the NIH and did a study of doctors who became patients, which had never really been done. And so I interviewed 75 doctors who became patients and wrote a book called When Doctors Become Patients. But they all said variations of the following. They all said, when I said, well, how is being a patient affected what you now do as a doctor? And they all said things like, well, patients used to say to me, Doc, would you pray for me? And I'd go, yeah, whatever. I'd poo-poo it. And then I became a patient and didn't know if I'd survive the hospital. And I suddenly realized how important all these existential, spiritual, religious issues are, but I was never trained to deal with them. I don't feel comfortable dealing with them. I don't know how to deal with them, so I just ignore them. So that struck me. And then I interviewed people at risk of different genetic diseases and wrote a book about 15 years ago called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And people would say to me, well, I know I have Huntington's disease, which is a terrible disease that Woody Guthrie died of, for instance. I know I have Huntington's disease because I have the gene. But why did God give me the gene and not give it to my sister? Or people would say, why did God give the gene to my sister and not to me? So again, these religious issues come up. And then, as Molly mentioned, I wrote a book called Designing Babies, which was about assisted reproductive technologies and IVF and different ethical issues that come up with that. And people would say to me, well, my sister tells me, well, I guess God just didn't, plan for you to have a child. Or people would say to me, well, I wonder, did God just not intend for me to have a child, not mean for me to have a child? So again, these issues of God and spirituality are sort of there in how patients think about illness. So I thought this is an important area. So I began to interview doctors about this and patients, and then finally I realized chaplains are the ones who really work in this area and have the most experience. But doctors would tell me, when I asked them about this, they would say, for instance, how much discomfort they have. So one surgeon I interviewed said that he was once wheeling a young boy into the operating room and basically thought the kid wouldn't survive. And at the last minute, the family said, "Doctor, would you pray with us?" And he looked at them, and they were Catholic, and he was Jewish, and he said, "No," because he felt, that's not me. That's not, I can't pray as a Catholic. Like, I don't know how to do that. Like, what is this? And he said, that decision has bothered me for years. And he said, but what could I have said? So I said to him, well, you could say something like, well, I'm happy to stand here with you, or I'm happy to support you, or something like that. There are ways of negotiating that. He said, wow. So again, doctors don't know how to deal with this space. Or doctors will say to a patient, how you doing? And the patient will say, well, I just hope I'm ready for God when I meet him. Well, did you take your medicine this week? Kind of just completely missing, missing the cue. So I started to interview chaplains, and I was amazed, because chaplains, like Molly, I have to say, do extraordinary jobs, but chaplains are often marginalized, and they are underappreciated and undervalued by doctors and hospitals. And partly, as you were saying, there's a sense that, here's biomedicine, and here's this other stuff, here's existential issues. And I think that that's not the way patients experience illness and families experience illness. It's all together. And patients, as Molly knows well, and families need sources of meaning and hope and connection and purpose, etc. And so I was struck by the stories and the range in ways in which chaplains today, who are board certified, who get good training, and I'll come back to that, not all do, unfortunately, but increasingly many do, and they have amazing ways of helping patients that I thought are helpful to everyone. In other words, these are things, even if you don't have a chaplain, we all have family members who've been ill, or we will if we haven't, or we may be ill and have family members. And so the insights that chaplains have, I think, are really extraordinary and have a lot of lessons for all of us. So one thing they did, one chaplain I interviewed, for instance, said that there was a young boy who, before he was going downhill fast, said, when I die, I want to donate my organs. And he was soon brain dead, and they were going to wheel him into the operating room and unplug him, and the doctors would harvest his organs, a horrible term. So the family said, well, we'd like to be there when our son dies. And the surgeon said, absolutely not. It's in the operating room. You're going to get upset, and it's going to take too long. We need to harvest the organs very quickly. Absolutely not. So then the family said, well, then screw this. We don't want to donate the organs. So they were just at loggerheads. And the chaplain said, let me talk to everyone. So the chaplain arranged that the family would come in. They would gown up in sterile gowns. They would be there for just 2 minutes, and then they would leave. And the surgeons were okay with that. So the surgeons wheeled the child in, and the family was there. And the chaplain said, did your son have a favorite song? And he said, Amazing Grace, the mother said. And so they sang Amazing Grace, and the whole operating team joined in, the doctors and nurses. Everyone started to cry. And at 2 minutes, the family left. And as they left, the chaplain, the mother held the chaplain's hand and said, thank you so much. We got to sing my son into heaven. So that's a kind of sort of intervention, for lack of a better term, that chaplains do. They sort of manage to sort of speak to the space in ways that, again, there are conflicts. It wouldn't have gone to a clinical ethics consult. Maybe it would have, but clinical ethics consults are few and far between, and chaplains are more present there. Other times, another chaplain described, for instance, an elderly man who was dying, and he was saying, what's the point of my life? I've been a jerk. I haven't seen my kids in years. I've messed up in so many ways. Why am I even still alive? This is ridiculous. There's no purpose in my life. And the chaplain picked up a piece of bread from the plastic tray by the patient's bedside and said, look at bread. Isn't bread amazing? He said, it tastes good. Jesus was called the bread of life. It nourishes us. It's from the earth. Like, maybe the point of life is not just to succeed in things, but just to appreciate the moment and what we have at the moment, the time we have now. And they talked more, and the patient felt so much better. can go on. I mean, there are other stories like that of sort of the things chaplains do. One chaplain described a patient who was was in the hospital, and every night at 2 a.m. the chaplain would call the nursing station. He can't sleep, and they'd try one thing, and the next thing they'd try something else, and the next night something else, and every night this was a problem. And finally, the chaplain said, "Let me go talk to this guy," and it turned out that this man knew he was dying. Was on a dying process, and but his mother committed suicide when he was a boy, and he thought it was because of him. And he carried around this weight. And so the chaplain called the family, the siblings, and had them come. And they said, your mom was hospitalized many times for depression before you were even born. I mean, this had nothing to do with you. And a weight was lifted, and he felt much better. So again, at this point, chaplains do sort of the only kind of psychotherapy in hospitals, I think. Like if you're diagnosed with cancer, the only person to come and say, what's this like for you? How are you doing? What are you thinking about? Is the chaplain. Psychiatrists are few and far between, and when they're called, they're there to give a medication to, calm people down. Not that that's not important for many people, but so chaplains play this amazing role, and I think they're really unsung heroes, but they're unappreciated. I mean, they're not reimbursed, so Medicare, Medicaid insurance doesn't cover chaplaincy, so hospitals have to pay on their own, and so a third of hospitals have no chaplains. Many hospitals have chaplains who are volunteer clergy who may be evangelical and want to convert people, or they may be of one faith and not know much about other faiths, whereas chaplains today get training to be interfaith, non-denominational. So I think they're great. I think what Molly does and her colleagues is great, and I think I tried to present in the book sort of inspiring stories of how chaplains help, but also how families find meaning. One last thing, for instance, was one mother's had a daughter who had Down syndrome and then developed leukemia, and the mother said to the chaplain at one point, and late at night, they're in the hospital. Do you think God gave my daughter leukemia because when she was born with Downs, I prayed for her to die? And this mother this was her quote, quiet prayer that she had, this quiet question. And so chaplains are able to sort of help patients understand, what's your view of God? God is loving. Would God want you to suffer? No, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are important issues that we'll all wrestle with at some point, and people I think come to this in different ways. So I can talk more, but I thought I'd stop there, and happy to.
I can always hear you talk a lot, Bob. It's you have an amazing wealth of anecdotes and knowledge about all of this. But we'll pause for a minute. I know that Zach is getting questions, and while we're gathering some questions here, I was struck by one of the quotes that you have in the beginning of your book by Anton Chekhov, which I just thought was so great, and it goes, "Between there is a God and there is no God lies a whole vast tract, which the really wise man crosses with great effort." This idea of how we are making sense of things that don't make any sense.
Right.
And that I had a very wise teacher when I was in seminary who taught psychology and spirituality. She was brilliant, Ann Ulanoff, who used to say, the conversation when you put a prayer up into the universe, the question is sort of, yes, the prayer matters, but what really mattered to her was who's answering. What is the imagining of who is answering? It can tell us a lot about somebody's faith or someone's experience with childhood trauma in faith, or somebody who might have had a toxic experience with God or faith of origin, a paternalistic God, a maternalistic God, a benevolent universe, a cruel universe. Who's answering? Those are some of the questions that chaplains wrestle with. So I think I'll turn it over to some questions. Anybody who has questions, please pull them up.
Please do submit your questions indeed to Natalie in the room or online. whether in the YouTube comments or by emailing me at znyain@stbarts.org. That's znyein@stbarts.org. But we already have one really good question going back to this idea of grief and psychosomatic symptoms and so forth. This person asks, is broken heart syndrome real?
So yes. So I don't know the term broken heart syndrome as a official syndrome, but people have broken hearts, and people undergo periods of, I'll call it depression with a little d. And we all experience depression at some point. We all get depressed at some point. Maybe your spouse died, your child died, your parent died, someone died, or you lost your job, or you lost your house in a hurricane, or whatever. You did terrible on a test in school. Some people have, we psychiatrists say, if you have major depression, which is if for 2 weeks most of the time you have no energy, most of the time you can't sleep, your appetite changes, you either eat too much or too little, you can't concentrate. If that goes on for you have problems sleeping, et cetera. If that goes on for 2 weeks, that is considered major depression, which we can treat with psychotherapy, and also that we know that medications, Prozac, et cetera, help a lot. But not all, quote, situational depression, so to speak, or bad things that happen in life that are upsetting meet that criteria. We may be upset, broken heart, but you're able to eat, you're able to sleep, or some of that you're able to do, or some of that you're able to do most of the time. Sometimes you can't. So it's not black and white. But yes, so broken heart is, and we know increasingly that the way we experience emotions is because of chemicals in our body, that there are neurotransmitters, there's dopamine, there's serotonin, that this is how we experience things. I should say this is also why exercise, for instance, helps with depression, because when we exercise, we're pumping endorphins, sort of our natural opiates, into our body. It turns out that there are proteins when we exercise that our bones release that give us strength and make us feel better, help our mood, help our concentration. Same if you don't sleep, it affects your immune system, and you can become depressed. It affects your immune system. So yes, it's a real thing. There are real symptoms of it, and but there are things we can do to feel better. Talking to people about it, social support is very important. For some people, mindfulness is important. Meditation can be important. Making sure you're eating well, you're sleeping well, exercising, things like that are all very important. And of course, for many people, spirituality, religion is also a source of strength. Then.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions of my own. We do have some more coming in. I'm curious about, I know that this is a big topic, and this came up in the last forum, and I know that it's a big topic in where I work, but from your research, Bob, how often does miracle seeking frustrate the opportunities that can be afforded at the end of life?
That's a great question. So a lot of patients talk about, we're waiting for a miracle. And so this relates, as you say, to the issue with clinical ethicists, that often the doctors know that the patient is going to die shortly, maybe days, maybe weeks, and that there's really nothing else we can offer to treat the illness. In other words, we've tried 5 chemotherapies, they're not working, the cancer continues to spread, it's just a matter of time. But the family will say, no, we want everything done. And one dividing point is, or a bridge to cross, if we get there, is if the patient's heart stops, do we try heroic measures to keep the heart going? And that often involves machinery that then it's very hard to take out. So do we resuscitate the patient, or do we have a do not resuscitate or DNR order? I lost my train of thought there on the background.
The miracle seeking.
The miracle seeking, yes, thank you. So a lot of families will say, we want everything done because a miracle is going to happen. And the doctors will say, well, there's not a miracle, it's not going to help the patient. But hospitals are very wary to say, no, even though you, the family, are saying that, we're going to just unplug the person and we're not going to do more, et cetera. And of course, one option here is comfort care, or palliative care, where we could say, okay, we can't give more chemotherapy, which has a lot of side effects, but we can make the person as comfortable as possible. And it turns out, the research shows that people who are often made as comfortable as possible live longer than those whom we try extra chemotherapy and radiation therapy. When my father died, we had this decision, and we either could have done nothing, or they'd say chemotherapy, which has, a 50% chance of giving him 6 more months, and we did that, and then he died anyway. So, and was miserable the last few months. So, I mean, we all know stories
Well,
like
I mean, I think we can look at Jimmy Carter as a great example of
Yes,
someone
right.
who's taken it home. And
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So some families say, well, a miracle's going to happen, and then there are arguments. The doctors throw their hands up in the air and say, the patient's waiting, the family's waiting for a miracle, it's not going to happen. And yet chaplains, I think, are often able to say that to help the family think, well, maybe a miracle is that he can say goodbye to you all. Maybe the miracle is that, there's time now where you can talk to him and you can come to peace, or with whatever tensions might have been in your lives, or you could talk to him about, the things that he would want you to do after he dies, as part of his legacy, et cetera, et cetera. So, or tell him how much you mean to him. So I think reframing miracles is important. And one thing that struck me throughout the book is, I almost called the book, What Do We Talk About When We Talk About God? But it turns out there was some other book, I Googled it, there's some other book with that title, because I was struck again and again how people use these words, God, religion, prayer, spirituality, in all kinds of ways that are different than the ways each of us use it. And my guess is each of us use it in ways that may be different from each other. So one woman I interviewed said, as a patient, said, I don't believe in anything, but sometimes I get on my knees and pray to the God I don't believe in. So, what does that mean? I mean, you can understand that. Or, another chaplain said he came to a patient's door and knocked on the door and said, I'm from the chaplaincy. There was an elderly woman. She said, stop right there. She did this. She said, you are anathema to me. My religion is CNN. I believe in facts and politics. And so the chaplain said, well, okay, and he went away. And the next day he went back and said, knock, knock. And he said, remember me? And she said, yeah. And he said, well, I know your religion is CNN, but let's talk about politics. What do you think of what's going on today? And they talked, and it turned out she was a very lonely woman who was dying, who was an atheist, but really had no one else in her life. And this became a very important connection to her because it was about what was important to her. And again, just to come back, we all have things that are ultimately important to us. We may not call it God, may not be a vision of, a guy in a white outfit with a white beard and a throne somewhere, but it could be just walking your church here, and it's a beautiful, inspiring place, and it makes us think of things larger than ourselves that go on.
Thank you. There's a question here. Is there any evidence or research or on a biochemical basis of the ability to experience spirituality and a relationship with God? Sounds
Yes.
like a psilocybin trip to me.
Right. Experience. Well, so we're learning a lot about this. It turns out that people who have more religiosity, which is strength of beliefs in religion or spirituality, have extra white matter in parts of their brain. They literally have neural reserves that buffer against depression. And so they find that you are less depressed if you have strong beliefs in religion and spirituality. Now, the scientists are quick to tell me it's not clear which came first. In other words, it may be that you have these bufferings and so you feel better and are less depressed, or it's because you have these beliefs. In other words, it's not clear what the relationship is, but certainly there's something that's there. People have, some people claim that intercessory prayer works, which is if I'm sick and you pray for me, even if I don't know you're praying for me, my body biologically will respond better. The research has not borne that out. I think certainly if you know people are praying for you, you may feel more hope, you may feel supported, you may feel cared about. And we also know that people who have a sense of religiosity and spirituality live longer. They do better. They're less depressed. They have a sense of purpose. They have something to live for. If you say, there's nothing worth living for, and people stop eating, they get depressed, they're going to not take care of themselves, their immune system's going to go down. So there's definitely a set of connections there.
Absolutely. I mean, I can see that all the time where I am. I mean, the fact is that if somebody is there just flattened, and not necessarily by physical pain, because I think
Right.
physical pain absolutely needs to be addressed first and foremost before a really thoughtful conversation can happen,
Right.
Unless it's a meditation. But, if they are just flattened by, just a crushing sadness and depression, there is no amount of clinical intervention that's going to prevent that person from, not dying
Right.
or getting out of the hospital.
Right.
In a good case, I absolutely agree with that. It's really one system. On that, can you talk a little bit about hope versus denialism,
Yes.
which is an interesting topic? How do they overlap,
Right.
and how do they diverge?
Right. So we all need hope, the sense that things, I don't say can get better. In some way they can get better, or things are not as bad as they might be. So denialism, and we all have both. We all deny for some things, and we all hope for some things, right? So you want hope. You don't want unrealistic hope, right? You don't want, I'm going to leave the hospital. I'm dying of cancer. I'm going to leave the hospital and go start playing tennis again, or go jogging again every day like I used to. I mean, that's not realistic. So, but you can't. So I think one thing chaplains do is help people think, well, what's realistic that you can hope for? You can hope to see your family again. You can hope to, have Zoom sessions. I'd love to see my grandkids on the West Coast. I'm not going to be able to visit them. Well, let's have a Zoom session or something like that. Or, I hope for to be comfortable. I hope for to appreciate life. I hope to be able to hear music again. So I think figuring out among, I would love to leave the hospital and live for another 30 years and go jogging every day. That's not realistic. So I think figuring out, in a way that's not denial, that's accepting the reality, but not looking at it as the glass is half full, so to speak. In other words, you could say I have 3 months left of life, let's say, and you could say, well, it's terrible, I'm just going to never leave my bed. Or you could have 3 months of life. What do I want to do with the last 3 months of life? And of course, this is something that I was very struck years ago. I read Seneca was an ancient Roman philosopher. There's a book called Letters to a Stoic by Seneca. And he says that Stoicism and Epicureanism, which people think of as opposite, are actually the same. Because in the end, the bottom line is we should enjoy each moment left on life, that we have on life, because it may be our last. Because it may be our last. And Seneca was then killed by the emperors of Rome. But his point was we should appreciate the present as much as possible, which is, in general, we may have 3 months to live, we may have 30 years to live, or 3 years, but in general, to see it as glass half full, that, okay, if I only have 3 months or 3 weeks to live, well, I want to see these people, I want to do these things, I want to make sure of my will, I want to leave money to a particular charity, or I want to sit outside a lot or smell flowers or whatever it is. I think there are things that we can realistically hope for that are not denialism.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think about a lot in the hospital, somebody used the word denial in my team, the palliative care team. We call it supportive care at Sloan Kettering, just in case you're worried. It's not palliative, it's supportive. But the chief of our department sort of corrected gently one of our doctors who said, well, this patient's just in denial.
Yeah.
And he said, no, first of all, denial is, I think it's a psychiatric term of art that actually means like there's something really not, it's dark out, don't you see? It's like, I insist that it's dark,
Yes,
so it's kind of not exactly connecting. But I think, there's a gradations of resilience, which may look a little bit like denial to some people, but is actually an incredibly important part of how people, I think, and I will say this, how I think many people are able to get through very vicious treatment is absolutely through a will. And obviously we can't will an overwhelming disease away. Once it's overwhelming, it's overwhelming. But there is something about this insistence on life that is very alive, more alive for some people than others, which sometimes gets put in that little bit of a denialism bucket.
And I would say denialism is used to denigrate people. So one chaplain described a case of, there was a Muslim patient, and the wife was saying she wants everything done. And the doctors wrote in the chart, she's in denial, she's resisting, she's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, not quite she's psychotic, but she's completely denying things. This is terrible. And so they had a Muslim chaplain come, and it turned out that in Islam, it's believed that before you die, you need to sort of proclaim the Lord's name. That's an important to show I'm not a scholar of Islam, but you need to sort of proclaim your faith in God before you die to go to heaven. And she was afraid that he wouldn't do that. And that's why she didn't want him to die. She wanted everything done. No, you have to keep him alive. And then finally the Muslim chaplain was able to say, look, he can't do that, but the Lord also says, and the Quran also says, that you should not make people suffer. And, in the end, to not suffer is also important. And she was able to accept that and say, okay, then I accept that, it's his time to go. So again, but the staff was saying she's in denial, right? And so rather than understanding where is she coming from, and I think another thing with chaplains is chaplains have time to get to know patients in ways that doctors and nurses unfortunately often don't, because they're so busy, and the average appointment with a doctor is 8 minutes or 11 minutes, depending where you are. And so chaplains have time to talk to you and get to know you, and that ends up, there are many stories in the book about how chaplains end up finding medically important information, like the case of the person who couldn't sleep at 2 a.m. because they have time to talk to the person.
Yeah, absolutely. I know chaplains' notes get read at Sloan Kettering.
I have a couple questions here, more on the topic of death and dying. One person asked, what are the qualities, and you've touched on this a bit, but what are the qualities of people who have an easier time dying, perhaps an easier time accepting?
So one issue I should say that's important is to think about these issues before you're at that point at the end of your life, and to talk to your loved ones about them. Unfortunately, what happens is some people, are in denial. I prefer the term they minimize it. So some people minimize the...
Bob, you haven't learned anything.
Right. So some people sort of minimize, I'm going to die. I have bad news for everyone. At some point, we all die, just saying.
100% chance of mortality.
Everyone knows that. They wouldn't be here otherwise.
Yeah.
But people don't lead their lives that way and don't think, okay, they don't have advanced directives. So I think only less than a third of America has advanced directives, which is a document that says, if I get to the point where the treatment is only going to be futile, I don't want heroic measures taken that if they're going to be futile, they're not going to help me, etc. And yet only a third of people have that in America, less than that, and half the time they're not followed because people don't talk to their family members about them. And so there's not, and I think Liz talked about this last time, like the case of the long-lost son showing up from California. The family doesn't know about what mom wants, and they're afraid, they feel guilty, and you can imagine, we all have parents who've been ill, or many of us have, and one feels all kinds of emotions of guilt, and I don't want them to die, of course, I want them to live, and so let's keep them alive. Well, alive they may be brain dead, but their heart's still beating because it's on a machine. So that's not a life as many of us would want a life. I think if you ask most people, would you want to be hooked up, as a vegetable, and we can spend, several $100,000 on that, or would you prefer for that money to be used for something else in the world, either for your kids' education or grandkids' education, or just to help the climate or whatever? No one's going to say, yes, keep me alive as a vegetable for a few extra months. I don't think. No one I've met has said that. But so I think talking about these issues is one way of dealing with it better, where you've thought it through rather than just minimize it and not think about it, but to talk about it and then have a discussion, because otherwise people may feel, well, my daughter wouldn't want me to die. Well, your daughter may not want you to live if it's going to be in a terrible, undignified state where, you're in diapers, for instance. So I think that's the main thing, is people who don't think about it in advance and wait till the last minute, or they may at that point be too far gone to communicate their wishes. That's a problem.
I think just adding on to that, one of the things that I've kind of come across a bit at Sloan Kettering, because our patients are quite young there, is young people who have cancer, advanced cancer in their 20s. There's a different sort of category of spiritual gathering there, and it's a little bit more chaotic for somebody who is young, who hasn't necessarily, it's very hard to be a 25-year-old bodhisattva at the end of, and show people a graceful exit. So I think there can be, that has its own conversation, and it's its own sort of raveling up, and it has more to do with families and family system, but it is not quite as, I mean, it can be difficult, and I think spiritually being ready, they do get there, but you can feel the adolescent bouncing around in that.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think, the answer, yes, you're right. There's other, I think that's another large category of people who, where if it's, death is unduly early in one's life. It's not the, quote, the usual arc of one's life adds extra complexity.
We have a couple of more minutes. I'm sure that Zach has, I have one question I want to ask you before we end, but I don't know if you have a question online.
Well, just shifting gears, moving, it's getting near to Halloween and all the spooky stuff. But one person asked, what is your experience with near-death experiences?
So, as some of you know, there have been reports of people who have near death, and I think there's also, I forget the term, not quite come back from death experiences where, the heart has stopped, and there are people who say they saw a bright light, for instance, and then their heart restarted, etc. So that hasn't happened to me, so I don't know exactly. So Oliver Sacks, who wrote Awakenings, for instance, and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, he's argued very much against that. There was a book that was a bestseller like around 10 years ago. I don't know if it was Heaven is for Real or Proof of Heaven or title like that. And it was a neurologist who said that this happened, and so this is proof of God. He said, well, no, that the brain has, not quite epileptic states, but like as with psilocybin. So there are people who take psilocybin and say they've met God, or they've had this incredible spiritual experience. So that there are, we may have phenomena in the brain. We know so little about the brain at this point. Really, this is the equivalent of, if someone asked Christopher Columbus in 1500, what have you discovered? He'd say, I discovered some islands off the coast of India. I'm going to call the West Indies. It took hundreds of years to figure out there's a whole continent and different people and lakes, and 300 years later, Lewis and Clark are still discovering things. So that's the same with the brain. We're just at the beginning, and it's going to take us a long time to figure out how all these phenomena in the brain work, including, what happens when someone takes psilocybin or has an experience of God, what that is neurologically. So I can't say. I mean, there are people who say this is an experience. Oliver Sacks says this is just a neurologic phenomenon. And I've not been there myself. I mean, I guess I would lean to say I'm more toward the Oliver Sacks camp if need be, because some of the reports are, one of the books was by a child who said, oh, yes, I met God and I had a near-death experience, and he was a guy on a throne with a white beard and a white gown. So,
Sure.
That's his experience. That's what he says. That's what he told his parents, and that's what the parents say he said his experience was. So, who knows?
I don't want to derail the conversation too much. I'm sure we could talk all day too. From the chaplain's perspective, you don't want to discount folks' experiences either if they.
No, of course not. And one of the things that we realized, and you talked about this recently in a place that we were at last week, where you talked a little bit about our enlightened, sort of medically driven 20th century has discounted all of those things that we used to know by intuition. Now, obviously, our intuition is a sort of primordial reptilian kind of fight or flight thing, and we sort of see and hear things that we maybe aren't there. But we do have intuition when you feel things in your gut.
Right. Yes.
You know,
right.
I mean, you do, and the body knows. And so I think the book is a lot about sort of re-engaging that piece.
Yes, and I should just say, my own sense is there's a lot of stuff we don't understand. That just you have experiences that this is just beyond our comprehension. That I think may suggest other things beyond us that we just don't understand.
Well, I think we're coming almost to the end of our time. I wanted to ask you if, in your sort of research of this, we didn't even touch on this kind of the chaplains who are humanist, and then you had encounters with chaplains who aren't board certified, who might be more evangelical and have maybe a different agenda, which is another topic. Were there chaplains that you found you were more attracted to when thinking about the end of your own life?
That's a great question. I think so first of all, I was so impressed with the chaplains I met. They were all such dedicated people. I mean, they were all, in my mind, saints with little s's, I'm reminded of William James in Varieties of Religious Experience said, a saint in any one religion would also merit being a saint in any other religion. That there's certain qualities of just people who are just incredible, like spiritually attuned people. And so I'm not saying these were, they weren't Mother Teresa's and kind of, Dalai Lamas, but they were all incredibly, motivated, committed, inspired. This is hard work to sort of talk to people who are dying most of the time. I mean, and there's burnout, another issue, et cetera, and people need to take care of themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So I found them all inspiring, and I think it was more the message of, kind of across the board, how to find things that are meaningful, often in unexpected ways. It could be the bread, it could be CNN for some people, so I think it was more all of that, the commonalities across, even though some of us are religion A, B, or C, or have CNN, there are sort of, common needs for something, think about something beyond us spiritually. Yeah. And the word spirit is from the Latin spiritus, which means breath. That opposed to sort of the mundane, just we're all in the end chemicals and carbon and oxygen, that there's something more, however we define that. And for some people it's nature, or it's just music, or it's walking in your beautiful sanctuary and just sensing something that grander than our lives and our immediate needs, and what do I want to do today, and just getting, eating and sleeping, going to the bathroom and getting up the next day. I mean, there's something more. And I think that's what I take away in a large part, and I try to convey that in the book.
That's wonderful, Bob. Can you all join me, please, in thanking Bob for being here? And his book is, I'm going to do a plug for you.
I meant there are flyers in the back.
And there are flyers, too, in the back if you want a discount.
You get a discount if
you
want
do.
a flyer in the back.
It's called Doctor, Will You Pray For Me? And I've read a lot of it. It's wonderful. So please grab a flyer, get the book, and it's a great boost for chaplaincy. So thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
That was fun. That was great. Great questions people asked.